Good evening, everybody. My name is Marshall Bhutan. I'm the acting director of the Center for the Advanced Study of India here at Penn, known to everybody as CASI. It's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce our speaker, Somini Sengupta, the international climate correspondent for the New York Times, who is visiting campus today. CASI is very pleased to join with Perry World House in bringing to you Somini's talk on climate change in India, supersizing risks for India's poor. I want to express our gratitude to Mike Horowitz, the newly appointed director, our interim director technically, of Perry World House, and to LaShawn Jefferson, its deputy director, for agreeing to co-sponsor this event with Perry World House. And I want to congratulate publicly Mike on his appointment. So I want to just say briefly that India is, as many of you may know, is in the crosshairs of climate change. Over a decade ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the group body of scientists and current and former policymakers who have assessed the risks of climate change, have seen South Asia, and India, of course, as one of the world's regions most likely to suffer severe effects from climate change. A decade later, just as scientists are concluding that climate change is proceeding more rapidly than they had originally expected, so also in India, during the last decade, we have seen the early and very worrying effects of climate change. The monsoon rains on which India's ability to feed itself and employment for over half of its workforce depend have been in deficit for 13 of the last 18 years. At the same time, India has experienced heavier than usual rainfall much more often than in the past, leading to waterlogged fields and flooded urban streets. Last September was the wettest September on record, maybe I should say in a century. And only a few months before that event, Chennai, India's fourth largest city, literally ran out of drinking water. The city survived only because several long trains a day of tanker cars bringing water to the city prevented it from dying of thirst. There's no one more qualified to speak about climate change in India and about the issues of its effects on Indian society and economy than Somini Sengupta. Somini, as many of you know, was a South Asia bureau chief for the New York Times and won the George Polk Award for her foreign reporting. She now reports on climate change worldwide for the Times. Somini is also the author of a tremendous book that I want to recommend to all of you called The End of Karma. It's a book about India's youth, which I really recommend very strongly. If you want to understand the social dynamics that led to the BJP's and Prime Minister Modi's victories last May in the general elections, go to Somini's book and read about what she describes as the hope and fury of India's young. So Somini brings to this topic both in-depth understanding of India and the breadth of her global climate reporting. We're very fortunate to have her. Please join me in welcoming Somini Sengupta.
Thank you for that really warm, generous introduction. And hi, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I really hope that this works. Yes, it does work. So I was born in Calcutta. I spent the first 7 years of my life in that Delta city close to where the Ganges River pours into the sea. In my memory, it was a city of steam and sweat, rice and fish, of languid, muggy afternoons, a city of water, lots and lots of water. So when I started covering climate change just a couple of years ago, one of the first places I went was to Calcutta. I wanted to see what the future might bring to the city of my past. I didn't have to look inside a crystal ball to see the future. I very much saw glimpses of the future already in Calcutta. The city is naturally low-lying. It's subject to storms that come off the Bay of Bengal. I saw now it faces more intense and more frequent storms, cyclones, higher river tides, and floods. The city is already very hot and muggy. Now it's getting hotter and muggier, measurably hotter and muggier. Kolkata, home to 14 million people, is entirely unprepared for the threats that it faces in the coming years. Hotter, muggier days, more extreme storms, and the Bay of Bengal rising, making it much harder for the people of the Sundarbans, which is this delta area, much harder for the people of the Sundarbans to live there. I spoke to many of them who were already in Kolkata, and they said that their paddy fields had already turned salty. Their houses fell down in one storm or another, so they packed up, got on a train, moved to Kolkata, the nearest city, to live among the city's poorest, in houses made of bamboo and tin, in neighborhoods where the drains back up in the monsoon anyway, and you have to hitch up your sari to wade through the stinking floodwaters. The thing I learned was that, worst of all, Calcutta had squandered what natural defenses it had against these hazards, putting millions of its poorest people at risk of heat-related illnesses, flooding, catastrophic flooding, waterborne illnesses. How had it done that? Well, the city had many lakes and canals, which at one point could absorb the rains. Those are now filled with muck, or they're built over altogether. An area of low-lying fields that once absorbed the runoff is now a suburb of high-rises. The rapid extraction of groundwater is causing the land to actually sink, making it even more of a soup bowl. Why do I tell you the story of Calcutta? Because it distills for me some of the lessons that I've learned as I've been writing about climate change in India and elsewhere. Lesson one, the impacts are being felt already, and they're a foretaste of what is to come. Two, climate change magnifies problems that aren't directly related to climate change, magnifies bad decisions that have been made over the years. Lesson three, how vulnerable you are as a person to climate change impacts depends on how vulnerable you are, period. If you're poor, if you work outdoors, if you've got no access to air conditioning or good healthcare or good nutrition or access to water, you are going to feel the brunt of it. And four, the government, national, state, local, can address this now to improve the health and well-being of its citizens. On that score, this isn't getting the attention that it deserves. According to a World Bank study published about 2 years ago, rising temperatures and erratic rainfall could depress the living standards of nearly half the country's population. This behind you is, as you can see, a map of South Asia. You can see the impact on India, particularly that central belt of India where it's really deep pink. The study found that 600 million Indians live in places that are especially vulnerable, not because the climate is changing fastest there necessarily, but because people there already lack access to nutrition, water, roads, basic healthcare, and so on. So climate change is not like some separate thing. It is very much part of the complexity of the societies that we live in. The impact of climate change in India's case is entwined with so much else. Caste inequality, religious divides, corruption, governance, the degradation of women in everyday life. Military analysts often refer to climate change as a threat multiplier. And that's why in the title of the talk I referred to supersizing. It supersizes the risks that are already in place. I get to tell stories for a living, so I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. I want to take you to a part of central India called Marathwada to meet this man, a farmer who I met last October when I was in the area reporting. I met this elderly man named Fakir Muhammad. He makes a living growing corn, cotton, and millet on his family's very small 1.5-acre plot of land. He told me that the rains had been bad for most of the last 9 years. And in 2019, when I went, the rains came late, long after he had sown his seeds. And when they came, the ground was so thirsty, it just drank everything in a flash. Then came 2 different pests that first attacked the corn, the maize, and then the millet. He told me that his harvest was going to be paltry this year. That's what he was planning on. The well in the Muslim neighborhood of the village where he lives was dry, entirely dry. He took me to a dam nearby, which was supposed to be the backup water for the village. That had turned to scrubland because there had been insufficient rains for the last 9 years. Every day, the local government sent a truck of water to fill the village trunk, but that was not anywhere near enough for the population. And so the women in Fakir Muhammad's neighborhood told me that they went to a nearby village every few days to collect water from that village well, and they couldn't really get too much because then they would get chewed out by the women of that village. So every person I met said their family bought drinking water. And this was October. This is when water levels are supposed to be right after the monsoon in that area at their highest level. Several women told me that when they were thirsty, they drank half a cup of water if they wanted a whole one. They went without a daily shower so their children could go to school clean and fresh. What does this story tell us? First, the fingerprints of man-made climate change. What does this have to do with climate change? Well, since 1950, annual rainfall has declined by 15% across this region, across Marathwada, according to scientists at the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology. In that same period, though, as Marshall was alluding to, extreme rainfall events, so cloudbursts that drop just a lot of water all of a sudden, those have shot up threefold. So climate change has really messed up the Indian monsoon, which is what India needs for, it's the main source of water, both drinking water and water for agriculture. There's either too little water or there's too much water. And in a country like India that depends almost entirely on the rains, this is really just catastrophic. But hang on, why then, in an era of water stress, did I find, just down the road from Fakir Muhammad's farm, fields and fields of water-guzzling sugarcane? How's that possible? It's one of the most water-guzzling crops out there. Well, that's because there are lots of sugar mills in the area. They pay good prices for cane. Their owners are either local politicians or friends of local politicians. What's more, the taxpayers of India help produce that sugar with subsidies for electricity to pump the groundwater to grow that sugar cane, subsidies for fertilizer, export subsidies. India is today the world's largest sugar producer. And that's not even counting the other cost to the Indian public, which is the health costs of sugar consumption. I tell you all this because this detail about sugar and subsidies, it's important because adapting to this new era of climate disruptions and extreme water stress may have very little to do with climate change solutions. It may really require rethinking things like, what do you grow? What do you subsidize? How do you use government incentives? How do you regulate the use of groundwater, etc.? This is a portrait of the kind of water stress that India faces in 2050. The dark orange, of course, signifies extremely high water stress. And you'll see it cuts across a belt of the world. You know, some of this is climate change. It is climate change supersizing, again, the risks that India already faces. We've been sort of squarely in this, you know, we've gone down this rabbit hole, very focused on India and climate change. I just want to take a quick pause and step back for a second so we're all on the same page about climate change globally. First, burning fossil fuels produces emissions of greenhouse gases, coal, oil, gas. That has the effect of basically covering the world in like a blanket, yeah? That is not like the tooth fairy. It's not something that one believes in or doesn't believe in. That is established science. It's been known for a very, very long time. It's not debatable. We have warmed the planet really, really fast. When you look at this chart, and Robert Rode is a Berkeley scholar, and he says facetiously, this is normal, totally normal, nothing to see here. If you look, since 1990, global emissions of carbon dioxide have increased by nearly 60%, just since 1990. So this process is happening and accelerating exceptionally fast. Since the beginning of the industrial age, so roughly the last 150 years, the world as a whole has warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius, close to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. The 20 warmest years on record, which is what this shows, have all been in the last 22 years. The ocean is heating up very fast. Its chemistry is being altered dramatically. That is not just bad news for a coral reef and the creatures that live in the sea, it's also really bad news for all the people who live along the coast, because what happens when the ocean warms? It swells, it rises. And remember, in India alone, there are hundreds of millions of people living along the coast. The stock market in Mumbai is right along the coast. There's a lot of really vital infrastructure also along the coast. So sea level rise is a real and present threat. Also, as the average temperature inches up, you know, and one might think, well, 1.1 degrees isn't a lot, right? But that's the average temperature. When the average goes up, so do heat spikes. And you all have seen record-breaking temperatures all over the world. In France last year, you'll remember that it was 115 degrees Fahrenheit, the highest temperature ever recorded. In India last summer, in May and June, a scorching heat wave saw temperatures peaking at 123 degrees in Rajasthan. Not just daytime temperatures, but also nighttime temperatures. And that's crucial because nighttime is when your body has a chance to cool down. So if night temperatures aren't going down as they should, it is really dangerous to human health. So who is responsible for all this? It will not surprise you that a handful of countries emit the lion's share of greenhouse gases. US, Europe, and China account right now for more than half of all global carbon emissions. And as this chart shows you, emissions are declining slowly in the US as well as in the European Union. They're growing slowly in China. Hang on, did I say they're declining slowly in the US and the European Union? They're growing in China. They're growing very, very fast in India. India accounts right now for 6.8% of global emissions, but as you'll see in that, it's notable for its pace of increase. Now, when you look at how much an average Indian contributes to climate change, of course, the gap is huge. How much does the average Indian, what's the carbon footprint of the average Indian? It's 1.7 metric tons. Is it just a rich country, poor country divide? Well, not exactly. Sweden's per capita emissions, 4.48. China, because it produces everything that the rest of the world buys, Industrial emissions are huge. So China's per capita emissions, 7.54. The United States is off the chart, 16.5. Saudi Arabia is the highest. That's the dark little Central Asia, West Asian country over there, and it's like 19 because of its oil production. No matter who is responsible, the impacts are clearly being felt already by Indians, the poorest of Indians. In June, when I visited Calcutta, the heat index, which is a measure of both temperature and humidity, peaked at 45 degrees Celsius, or 113 degrees Fahrenheit. In Gorihat Market, which is a very popular shopping area where I once watched my mother unfurl sari after sari, I met one street vendor who leaned wearily against a wall, dabbing his head with a handkerchief in vain. Next to him, another vendor squatted on his haunches from fatigue and nausea. Now, you might be thinking it's already really hot and muggy across much of India, and you would be right. But spikes in temperature during hot summers can be and has been already deadly. There's a point at which sustained exposure, like several hours of exposure to a certain level of heat and humidity, literally becomes unbearable. And there's some scientific debate about where that point is, what's the heat index and for how many hours. But there is a point where the body just physically cannot cool down. And so public health people in India were telling me that extreme heat is becoming to them a quiet and far-reaching danger because it's already making people sicker and poorer. And in the years ahead, it stands to devastate the health and livelihoods of tens of millions more if global temperatures keep rising. When I was reporting 2 summers ago, talking to people in Delhi and Calcutta and Hyderabad about heat waves, over and over, I heard people describe the price that they're paying. One woman said she couldn't fall asleep until 4 a.m. because the day's heat just turned her top floor apartment into an oven. And so she managed to sleep 3-4 hours at best throughout the summer. A day laborer said that he had suffered heat stroke, missing a week's work and therefore a week's wages. A shopkeeper said that while he managed to stay cool in his ground floor storefront, his father, who was elderly, his blood pressure rose every summer as he sweltered upstairs all day. One home ministry official told me at the time, she was a public health specialist, she said, these cities are going to become unlivable unless urban governments put in systems of dealing with this phenomenon and make people aware. So, what does the future hold for India? Well, there are many futures ahead. It's up to us, really. And it's up to us to figure out what that future looks like really, really soon. This is, I'm going to return to this a little later, 2020 and the rest of this decade happen to be an extremely, extremely important moment. So we can, as a whole, the world can either very quickly reduce global emissions and keep temperatures from rising to catastrophic levels, or not, and let temperatures rise to catastrophic levels. In any case, all of us are going to have to make some real adjustments. We're going to have to learn how to live. That's sometimes called adaptation. We're going to have to learn how to live on this hotter planet, in this climate that we have all inexorably changed. What can India do? One argument you often hear is that India didn't create this problem. The rich world, the industrialized, created this problem, and that it's now, India's turn to lift people out of poverty, grow the economy, and so India should get to keep burning coal in the years to come to extend electricity to its people. Here's the reality, though. I mean, we've already seen how much climate change is hurting the health, well-being of Indians, potentially posing a huge danger to the economy. But the things that contribute to climate change, things like burning coal, things like allowing diesel cars and buses to ply through Indian cities, all those things have enormous public health costs, immediate public health costs. One recent study published last December found that air pollution killed 2 million people in India a year. An earlier study said that number was 1.24 million. Other studies have shown how air pollution affects the immune system, even if it doesn't kill you, and it affects child development, both in utero and in early childhood. For India right now, on the mitigation side, by mitigation I mean how to bring down its own emissions, or how to stop its own emissions from rising very fast, which is more accurate. For India, the big dilemma on mitigation is what to do about coal. Coal has powered the industrial age, and it has now led the planet to the brink of catastrophic climate change. It is the dirtiest fossil fuel. Indian officials have told me when I've reported on this that coal is cheap and plentiful, and they must burn much more of it to get people out of poverty. Careful though, because is it really cheap? Solar energy is cheaper in some markets now than coal. Solar isn't growing, incidentally, as fast as many had hoped and as fast as the government had aspired. India's existing coal-fired power plants are operating nowhere near capacity. They happen to be financed by India's state-owned banks, so at the point that they become stranded assets, that's again the Indian taxpayer holding the bag. Most importantly, when you factor in the health costs of burning coal, it turns out coal isn't so cheap after all. And while the expansion of coal is slowing down, in India and in China and in parts of Southeast Asia, coal continues to grow at a fairly rapid clip. One energy analyst who I spoke to when I was reporting this story said, quite simply, the main reason why coal sticks around is we built it already. Coal is a very powerful incumbent. So, what will it take to have a livable future, both in India and globally? Well, we've talked about the mitigation, right? Mitigation as in how to keep emissions from growing as fast. On that, there's sort of three categories. Emissions from energy use, we've talked about coal, emissions from transportation, that's a huge issue, and less so for India's case is land use, how we grow our food. So the big changes, require, of course, mitigating emissions, slowing down emissions, and also adapting to this new reality. That means very different things for different countries. In India's case, adaptation really means tackling things that don't at face value have anything to do with climate change. So how to store, share, and manage water, what kind of crops to grow, how to use subsidies, loans, etc., to encourage farmers to grow things that grow well in arid climates. Chickpeas, for example, lentils. India imports chickpeas from Canada. You can grow a lot more chickpeas, and chickpeas do really well in dry, arid soil, and they actually nourish the soil. Things like city planning codes. When I showed you pictures of Calcutta and I told you that all these water bodies have been built over, the same has happened in Mumbai. So the devastating floods of recent years, a lot of that is because there's no place for the water to go. So these are not climate change policies. These are, what do you say to developers who want to build over a creek, who want to build over wetlands? These are all political choices. They don't require a lot of unicorn technology. These are political policy choices, and public pressure will matter. Lastly, this is a crucial time. Why is this crucial? Because according to the best scientific models, global emissions must be reduced by half in the 2020s if we are to stave off catastrophic global warming. Why so soon? Like, why 10 years? And how is that even possible? Why 10 years is because we've waited so long. Had we started 50 years ago, even 30 years ago, the pace of change could be slower. But if we are to meet the objectives of the Global Climate Agreement, the Paris Agreement, the US, of course, is the only country in the world that doesn't belong to the Paris Agreement. If we, as a world, are to meet those goals, it means having global emissions in the next 10 years. So it's a really, really critical year. All the while, climate change has devastated India's water savings bank. In the last 20 years alone, the Himalayas have lost 1.5 feet of ice every year since 2000. It's the equivalent of 8 billion tons of water every year. So, why so soon? Because we have waited so long. I didn't click that when I was supposed to. So, thank you very much for listening. I'm good. I know you've got lots of questions. Questions that end with a question mark. So please, I would love to hear your questions and try to answer them. What would be great, I think, is if you could raise your hands. Students especially, I really would welcome your questions first. And just in the interest of time, if we could do like 3 questions on one side and 3 questions on another, and then I'll answer. So, hands, please. There's a question here and 2 questions back there. So let's do those 3, okay? 1, 2, 3.
Thank you so much for the talk. I had a question about something you mentioned earlier, which was that religion and caste politics does also play a role in a lot of the policies that exacerbate climate change. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
And 2 in the back over there.
Thank you so much. My question is associated with what you hit upon in the lecture today. I struggle with it every day. I think I struggle with seeing the effects of climate change on one hand in India, and also listening to what the government has to say in terms of things like intended nationally determined contributions, which stress on this aspect of sovereignty, of we didn't contribute to it in the first place, so why should we cut back on our development? So how do you reconcile these two in your mind? And you kind of touched upon it, but I was curious to know more.
Okay.
So you highlighted that public pressure matters a lot going forward. I was wondering, what do you see that actually looking like? There's been a bit of like a groundswell in activism, especially student activism in cities around India. But like proportionate to the population, it's still not really the pressure that we need. So like, what do you think about that?
Those are really excellent questions. I'm going to just take them one by one. On the first one, on the last question, you're right. There has been a upswell of youth protests. Honestly, I don't see the climate change activism in India as being as robust as some of the youth climate activism in other countries. I think there are lots of reasons for that. There are other issues that are pressing, and that's totally understandable. But this is just how democratic societies work. People get to decide what's important to them and when they will put public pressure on their politicians. And climate change per se has not emerged as an election issue in many countries around the world. There are some notable exceptions. It was a big issue in the Australian election. It was a very big issue in Denmark. Doesn't mean that people don't care deeply about it. Even in this country, in the United States, poll after poll shows you that well over 70% of Americans are worried about the impact of climate change on their lives, want the government to do more about it. There isn't also a sort of science-denying movement in India, but I think there are all kinds of other issues that have taken center stage, but it might change very quickly. On the question right before you, which was about, every country, according to the Paris Agreement, the way the Paris Agreement is written, every country gets to decide for itself its own path in reducing emissions or slowing down emissions. In India's case, emissions are going to grow for the next decades. The question is, how fast will it grow? The agreement, the international agreement, is designed in such a way that countries come together every year and they get up on stage and they tell each other, this is what we're doing. And it's built around a system of peer pressure, kind of global diplomatic peer pressure. All eyes are on what presidents and prime ministers and environment ministers will say this year in November at the next such international climate meeting. In Glasgow, Scotland, I will be there to cover it. This year is exceedingly important because this is the first year, it's 5 years after the Paris Agreement was done, and this is the first year when countries are expected to say, here's our revision. This is how we're going to revise our own targets for slowing down emissions or reducing emissions. All eyes are on what China will do. All eyes are on what the European Union will do. Many eyes are on what India will say it will do. And of course, everyone's eyes are on what the results of the US elections will be, because these talks begin right after the US election. So this is really just a key year for global negotiations. On your question about how do these other divides weigh on climate change impacts, it's really quite simple. Caste, religion shapes where you get to live. In rural India, not in urban India so much, in rural India, it shapes your access to water. Water, again, is extremely gendered because as in many societies, particularly in rural India, but also in urban India, where women don't necessarily, where water doesn't come out of the tap, it often falls to women to get water and make sure the family has enough water. And even in Chennai, when I was writing a story about the impact of the water scarcity in Chennai, I heard again and again and again, women telling me how they went without a daily shower. They certainly went without their customary, in the heat of summer, 2 showers a day, so that children could go to school fresh and clean. 3 more questions. There's one here, and one there. Here we had 3 women, now we have 3 men. Try to keep this.
Hello. Yeah. So one image which stood out over there was the plastic litter which was there in the Kolkata lakes, which you showed. While there has been debate about plastic versus glass in terms of usage with respect to carbon footprint, recycle, etc., just wanted to understand your views about has any significant progress been done along that front? And because at least there are differing articles wherein some articles show that plastic, especially its recycle rate for something, has really improved over the last few years. Just wanted to understand your views on that.
Okay. Next one was here.
Thank you. You mentioned in your talk, and this is something I've seen personally, how different areas of India can have vastly different changes due to climatic conditions, how one state can be flooding while the state next door can be in a drought. Given that, I'm curious as to what level you think policy changes should occur at. Do you think it's possible for India to have a national policy, or is it a state, or is it a city, or even just a community level sort of thing?
Okay. And there was a question on this side. Yeah, in front, the man over here.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. I think India, as you mentioned, in India, especially among the political leaders, there's no dispute that climate change is happening. There's a Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So given that, one of the things I've been puzzling over is why there has been so little activity with planning and planners planning for climate change, either mitigation or adaptation, particularly because their horizons are always future-oriented activities and plans, right? So what accounts for the absence of central government planning or municipal planning around climate change in India?
Okay. I take that one and that one because they're related first. Some things have improved at both, particularly at the state government. I can tell you some things have improved, as well as at the national government. Early warning systems for extreme weather events, that's really improved and has brought down mortality levels routinely. So a cyclone would kill hundreds of people. That's far more rare now. That has improved in India as well as Bangladesh, by the way. Look, some of it is also about time. You know, election time scales are about delivering short-term returns. But I guess what I'm curious about, what I'm really, it's really hard to predict. When does something like the demand for clean air become an issue for elected officials and also civil servants to really address? When is that tipping point, when that happens? Clearly, in China, some years ago, the authoritarian state faced enough public pressure on air pollution and had to address it. Closed down coal-fired power plants around major cities. Air pollution in China has gone down significantly. Now, China also instituted rules that only China can institute. They made it really hard to register a new car, a new, conventional internal combustion engine car. The wait times are like really long and it's really complicated. Those things may be harder to do in other cities. But there are plenty of places also, in democratic societies where policymakers, elected officials have chosen to enact policies that both clean up the air and reduce emissions, particularly on whether you can bring cars, polluting cars, into the central part of the city. In London, it now costs, like 24 pounds to bring an older diesel-burning car into the city center. In Barcelona, there are entire blocks where no cars are allowed. So, cities are beginning to do that. And when I speak to officials there, they say quite clearly, look, we face the pressure to clean up the air from our citizens. And so we think this is a good move. There will be opposition to this, and they have faced opposition to it, but they do it anyway because there is a public demand. So at what point does the demand for clean air or clean water become a political issue for democratically elected officials? I don't know. And that relates to your question, right? Does this happen at the national level? Does this happen at the state level? I think it depends on different kinds of things, right? I mean, a carbon tax, for example, can really only happen at the national level, right? The energy mix of the country, how much coal, how fast to rev up solar, those things can only happen at the national level. There was, by the way, very ambitious targets that the Modi administration set for renewable energy production. But then there was a tariff imposed on the import of solar cells, which meant that it slowed the whole thing down. So it's nowhere on target. India is nowhere on target to meet its 2022 renewable energy target. So on certain things, it has to happen at the national levels. On other things, like managing and sharing water, that has to happen between states. As you well know, that's a huge issue. How a river doesn't know state boundaries, but how much of that river's water does one state get to keep versus another? Those have long been politically contentious in India, but I think climate change just, again, kind of supersizes, the potential for those clashes. And there was one question here about plastic. I'm going to throw that one right back at you, because I don't think there's been a great study about how well plastic bag bans in particular have worked in Indian cities. It was tried in Delhi. It may still be in place in Delhi. You probably know this. Is it still in place? It was when I lived there several years ago. Bombay floated the idea, but then quickly, after some pressure from plastic bag makers, said, okay, no, not quite. But I think that's a wonderful study for someone to do, right? Where have plastic bag bans worked? What are the alternatives? What has it actually measurably led to a measurable decline in trash? To the naked eye, it would appear not, but I haven't seen the evidence to answer that. How much more time do we have for questions? Okay, all right, we've got some more questions. And we can wrap up even earlier than we need to. Okay, so there's one there and two in the back.
Thank you for a fascinating discussion. I was wondering whether, in addition to what you talked about earlier about the politics and caste and society, whether you'd want to comment on the governance of climate change. Because the way that evolved initially at the national level was to have a separate ministry or a separate department. Nobody else talked about it. At the state level, these departments converge over different issues. So the Pollution Control Board is completely different from, say, the urban development departments. And at the city level, there are different discussions happening. At the district level, the district collector is a law unto himself or herself. So within these different levels of administrative and bureaucratic systems, how do you see climate change playing out over the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Question right next to you.
Actually related to the previous question about public demand, but I'm curious to know from your personal experience what public opinion on climate change looks like in India right now, particularly outside of large English-speaking cities where students are protesting. So does the rest of the country, are they aware about carbon emissions? Is there even a demand? Are they aware about consequences and potential consequences to their personal lives if the policies that you say are the best are implemented? For instance, if there was to be a reduction in emissions from cars or larger vehicles, then potentially truck drivers might have to ply less in rural areas. So are they aware of these things? What does public opinion look like outside of large cities?
And then there was one right there, the blue jacket, yeah.
Thank you again. I'd say my question is, I know we've been discussing a lot about the governance and like how the government specifically can implement policy, but looking towards like unicorn companies, like I know Renew Power within India is one of the companies that's leading efforts towards like distributed solar, and utility wind. What potential for like private sector development to step up and like where the public sector is lacking do you see in climate change within India specifically and potentially across the globe?
On the question of public opinion, it's a really good question that I cannot answer because I have not seen good survey data to tell you. Anecdotally, I can tell you that when I talk to an ordinary farmer, I hear a very high level of awareness about, the monsoon changing. I hear a very high level of awareness about pollution, but that's really just very anecdotal. On the question of, who should be in charge, I don't, I'm not sure that my opinion matters on who should or should not be, but what I can tell you is the trend that I'm just beginning to see is climate change going from just a climate ministry or an environment ministry in various countries, I'm not now talking about India, to becoming an issue that the finance ministry also has to deal with, or maybe the foreign affairs ministry has to deal with. In this country, for sure, the Pentagon is very aware of the threat multiplier of climate change, both in terms of how it might impact conflicts around the world, but also the threat that climate change poses for military installations all over the world. Extreme heat and sea level rise are pretty big threats for US military installations around the world. So to answer that question, certainly globally, I've seen in various countries the issue going in front of government officials who are not just environment ministry folks. And just one last beat on that, certainly the Paris Agreement, the global agreement, could not have happened without heads of state and government deciding that it was in their country's national interest to sign up to this. On the question of private sector, you had the private sector question, right? I think in renewable energy, there's a huge, an enormous market out there. But of course, government policy, especially on things like tariffs, on things like import duties, on solar cells, all of those things impact what a renew power can and cannot do, impact how fast renew power can grow. It would be important for you, if you're interested in this, to look at the energy budget that comes out and see how much money is the government pouring into coal and how much money is the government pouring into promoting renewables. The last time I saw those numbers, the gap was very wide. The lion's share of government money was going into fossil fuels. Can we take a couple more questions? All right, let's do just a couple more. There was one hand. Yeah, there was a hand here, and if you are really quick, maybe we could do two more over here.
Yeah, my question was mostly about the terms in which this, worrying about climate change can be pitched to a poor country, in the sense that, climate change writ large is something that's somewhat of a luxury good that people in the West can worry about. Now, writ small, everybody faces consequences, as you showed us very persuasively in your talk. But, talking about pollution, water management, these are more immediate sort of things. So why is it that we don't use that vocabulary instead? That was one question I had. The second question was about nuclear energy and what role you think that should play in the energy mix.
And very quickly, here.
I just wanted to know a little bit more about what India's plans are for the Sundarbans and what's going on. And so I'm studying it myself, but I just wanted to know your opinions or anything. Yeah.
Another one?
Yeah.
Hey, I had a question on the public pressure from India, where majority of the population are still chasing the basic necessities of life. How do they prioritize climate change in their own struggle. It's like a vicious cycle where the government is helping these people to achieve the basic necessities, and to do so, they have to accelerate the economy. But in doing so, there are more emissions, and I don't see a solution how the majority of the population of India can actually help build up public pressure to go for the climate change.
On the first question, look, it's up to, I think, policymakers, advocates to decide how they want to pitch the issue. I think you're absolutely right that water and air, clean water, the availability of water are immediate, everyday issues. So too, clean air, which is precisely why I keep waiting to see when clean air becomes a real political demand. And as far as I can tell, it really hasn't been, right? There's outcry when the pollution season gets really bad, but it hasn't been like a sustained political demand. On your question of nuclear energy, it's interesting. India worked very hard to get that nuclear agreement back in 2006. But, nuclear energy continues to be quite expensive, and it hasn't really taken off in India as yet. In other countries, many countries see nuclear as the, solution to producing clean energy. And then there's Japan. Japan had a pretty bad experience after Fukushima, no longer sees nuclear energy as the solution to climate change and has returned to coal-fired power plants. I think every country for itself will have to really work out the nuclear question. On the Sundarbans, I actually haven't seen any precise, adaptation plans for the Sundarbans myself, so I'd be interested in seeing one if you have. On your last question, that is climate change, kind of separate and esoteric from the immediate issues that poor people face. Climate change impacts every issue that the poor face in India. That's kind of what I've discovered in my reporting. It affects agricultural production, it affects public health, it affects water supply. And literally it can affect like whether you can live in a particular part of the country, like the Sundarbans if they're driving. So in some ways, it is particularly an acute issue, for India's poorest. In my reporting, I certainly haven't seen it as a luxury issue at all. Thank you all very much for listening. Thank you for your smart questions.